Common Sense Army, it is Monday, and on this episode of the Why I'm Right podcast, we're continuing the conversation from last week, talking about these Kill the Jew protesters around the country. They're starting to get out of control, but there is an equal and opposite reaction that's occurring right now. We're going to dive into that and much more on this episode. We're going to dive into Hillary Clinton coming out of her swamp hole and getting back into the public eye, and what she had to say this past week. Very interesting stuff coming out of Hillary Clinton, and obviously the disastrous week it was for Joe Biden and Democrats across the country. Again, this is the Why I'm Right podcast.
We live in a world filled with noise and confusion, clickbait, and outright lies in the media. But here, we cut through the clutter to find the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. This is Why I'm Right, the podcast where we dig deeper, ask the tough questions, and unravel the tangled webs of political and current events. Join us as we dissect the latest news, analyze political rhetoric, and challenge the narratives that dominate the mainstream discourse. We're not shy. From dissecting the motives behind policy decisions to uncovering the hidden agendas of public figures, it's what we do. It's time to think for ourselves. This is Why I'm Right. And now your unafraid and unapologetic host, Matt Taylor.
Common Sense Army, I hope you had a great weekend. This is the Why I'm Right podcast, and I am Matt Taylor. And if this is your first episode ever on the Why I'm Right podcast, I'm happy to have you here. If you're already a member of the Common Sense Army, I'm glad you're here as well. If you guys can do me a favor before every episode I say this, we're trying to grow the Common Sense Army one day at a time, one podcast at a time, and the one way you can help do that is by clicking subscribe, sharing these videos with your friends, sharing them with your family, sharing them with people who agree and disagree with us. The most important thing to our nation right now is our ability to have debate in this country so that we can grow as a nation and grow together. And so without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. If you haven't seen and you haven't been watching, obviously these protests are continuing around the country. They're continuing to be out of control. Colleges around the nation are in complete chaos. But there is nothing new. We talked about it last week. There is nothing new. This is a liberal and a funded attack by George Soros and elites in this country to sow division in our country and put out a false sense of division because people are starting to unify. But throughout history, even in the last 50 years, we've seen liberal protesters grapple onto different agendas, different social issues. The culture war is real. And this is just another example of it. This is the latest example, and I believe this is the worst example, and this is the example that has gone wrong. But over the last 50 years, we obviously had the Occupy Wall Street movement, which later led into the environmental and climate change movement, obviously the BLM and LGBTQ movements, and now we're here with the Kill the Jews, pro-Hamas, pro-terror, pro-Palestine protest in this country. And so the left creates and fabricates these issues, these culture wars, because they believe that this somehow divides us. They don't really believe many people agree with this story. And normally these protests and these social issues they grab onto are at least something that Republicans or people on the right can understand. They might not agree with it, but they can at least understand. Think about it. Occupy Wall Street, it was, we need to go after billionaires. These people are taking advantage of us. We need to go after them. People understood that message. You might not have agreed with the message, but you at least as a right-wing person understood the message. Environment, obviously, we need to save the polar bears. We need to save the world. The ice caps are melting. Plastic is, straws are hurting the turtles. I mean, we at least understood the message. Even with the BLM movement, defund the police movement, we understood that there is racism in our nation's history. And even though we may not have agreed with defund the police movement, we could at least grab onto the idea and understand the idea and the ideology behind the movement. And now we're in the first time, I believe, with this LGBTQ pushing an agenda on young people in this nation and this now Kill the Jew, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, pro-terror protest. We're now for the first time seeing an example of a culture war that many people in this nation, including myself, can't even grab onto the idea, understand the idea behind the protest, behind the agenda. And so obviously, as I said on last week's episode, the purpose is to make it look like they're unified, the left, these protesters, that many of them are being paid to be there, or many of them have nothing going right in their life and they need something to grab onto to give them purpose in this country. The purpose is for you and I to feel crazy, to look like we're the minority. In reality, we're the majority. We are just the silent majority. You know, the media loves these stories. The media loves this because it gives them something to showcase every single night on their networks. They could bring on guests to talk about it for hours and hours and hours. The media loves it. So you're going to continue to see across the country on these college campuses like Harvard, Columbia, NYU, you're going to continue to see all of the things going on. We've even seen campuses like USC cancel their graduations or change their graduation plans because there are death threats and issues towards Jewish students on the campus. And as I said last week, at some point in time, when these people are on a college campus yelling death to Jews and there's Jewish students going to that university or going to that college, eventually it's going to get to the point where someone gets hurt. And who is to blame when someone gets hurt? It's a matter of time. I'm telling you, it's the sad reality we're living in right now. It's just a matter of time before one of these protests outbreaks into something more than free speech. Many people, including myself, think it's already gone too far because they're now saying death to Jews. There's Jewish kids on the campus. They need to be escorted from class to class to their dorm room from armed guards because there's a fear of actual hatred turning into violence. And so at some point, like I said, the free speech element of this is, yes, I'm a free speech supporter. I think free speech is the most important element to our rights and our freedoms in this nation and nations around the globe. But this is not free speech. This is insurrection at its finest. You know, they love that word. They love throwing that word around on January 6th, saying Trump had an insurrection and was inciting violence. What is this? What are these people doing on these campuses yelling death to Jews, kill the Jews, death to America, death to Israel? Is that not insurrection? Is that not inciting violence, especially when there's Jewish students going to the schools that now need armed guards to take them from class to class? That's insurrection at its finest, at its most pure element. But again, as I said last week, don't be fooled by this. Don't be fooled by this. The majority of this country and the majority of the world, to be honest with you, does not agree with what these liberal elites are funding and what these liberal protesters who have nothing else to live for but grab onto the latest social issue that they believe they're doing something right behind. Don't fall for it. Because the silent majority in this nation doesn't buy it, doesn't believe it, doesn't support it, and in fact is adamantly against it. And as I said on last week's podcast, I don't know what the solution is. But I also don't believe it's enough anymore to be the silent majority. I think at some point in time, we need to come to the table with facts from an educated standpoint and hold these people's feet to the fire and really ask the questions of why? What are you actually supporting? Do you support all of Hamas? You know, like the Hamas that throws gay people off buildings? Do you support all of Hamas? Do you support everything about Palestine? Do you really believe we should kill all the Jews in this country, all the Jews on the world? Because that sounds a lot like something a Nazi and Hitler would love saying in Nazi Germany. And so I believe at some point in time, the silent majority needs to put the feet to the fire of these liberal people who have no backbone and no belief themselves, who are just following an agenda I showed you on last week's podcast. Some of these people that are at these protests have no idea why they're even there. When they're being interviewed, they're being asked, what are you supporting? What are you here protesting? What's the goal? And many of them can't even answer. And as I said before, many of these people can't even point to Palestine, Gaza, Israel on a map. And the clip I showed last week, the quote was, "I wish I was more educated." And I believe we, as the silent majority, needs to continue to put the feet to the fire and continue to say, yes, we all wish you were more educated. Because you're spitting hate. And these people, like I said, they have no backbone or belief themselves. They'll grab onto any social issue. And so the point of this podcast, and what I wanted to take from the conversation we had last week and bring here, is we're now seeing the equal and opposite reaction. I said it before. We used to, as right-winged people in this country, even if we disagreed with the message, disagreed with the protest, we could at least understand the meaning, the ideology behind the protest. But right now, I don't see it. I don't understand it. And so I'm going to play a clip here that I think is incredibly important. Because now we're seeing these protests from the left go too far. These are left-wing protests gone wrong. And there is an equal and opposite reaction coming. It's already started. But I want to play this clip. This is clip 1. And I had this on my social media page this past weekend. Again, if you don't follow me on Instagram, make sure you do. It's at Why I'm Right on Instagram. We're on Truth Social, and on X, we're at Why I'm Right Pod. Make sure you follow us. Like I said, we're continuing to grow every single day. But I wanted to bring this up, even though it was on my social media over the weekend. Here's a clip. And when I saw this, I almost threw up. And we'll talk about it in a second. Just listen to this.
What we're going to do is we're going to shout, "Free Palestine." Can I hear that? Free Palestine! If you're a drag queen and you know it, shout, "Free Palestine!" If you're a drag queen and you know it and you really want to show it, you're a drag queen and you know it, shout, "Free Palestine!" Excellent.
Again, I'm speechless when I listen to that, when I see that. Not only is that indoctrination obviously having a young mind be witnessing or adamantly supporting, obviously the parents are bringing these kids to these events where they're being introduced to sexual elements that a young person, a young mind in this nation, I believe shouldn't be exposed to. When we sexualize youth in this nation and you're going to have them be exposed to drag queens and pushing the LGBTQ plus IA, whatever the acronym is at this point, when you're pushing that on the youth, when minds aren't fully developed, we're only going to see the indoctrination get worse. But now you're having those same people who are now pushing LGBTQ down the throats of these youth. They're now having young kids yell, "Free Palestine," when those kids have no idea what they're even yelling or what that could mean at all. You could tell them to yell anything, and I guess if you're reading it in a children's book and you have a drag queen reading the children's book and holding it up, it makes it fine. Well, it's not fine. And like I said, there's an equal and opposite reaction coming down to in this nation right now. And we're starting to see the equal and opposite reaction because at this point, these liberal ideologies and these movements, climate change was one thing. BLM was one thing. Occupy Wall Street was one thing. But this is where you lose the mother who typically votes liberal. In New York City, New Jersey, around the country. People that would normally vote liberal, when you start pushing sex and LGBTQ down the throats of youth, good luck. Good luck, Democrats. Continue to do this kind of stuff because this is how Republicans will continue to win moving forward. This is how the Republican agenda moves forward. And so I want you to listen. This is clip 2 here. This is the equal and opposite reaction that I'm talking about. Here's cut 2.
Our new poll, which was conducted by SSRS, finds Trump is leading Biden, who has ample work to do with his base and with independent voters who are breaking to his GOP rival. In a head-to-head race, 49% of voters say they'd pick Trump for president, compared to 43% for Biden. That's a 9-point Trump advantage with independent voters. And add in third-party candidates, and Trump's lead jumps even more. He has 42% to Biden's 33%, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gets 16% of the vote.
You hear that? Trump is winning the election right now. And again, I believe a lot of this has to do with what's going on in the culture wars in this country. People tell you, the media tells you that many people hate Donald Trump, but I can tell you something. Parents in this country hate what's going on more than they hate Donald Trump. People hate what's going on. If you're Jewish in this country, you hate what's going on right now. Even if you dislike Donald Trump, you hate what's going on, and the support the Biden administration and other in this Democrat Party are supporting right now. You hate the Kill the Jew movement more than you hate Donald Trump. And so I believe the equal and opposite reaction is the Republican movement has become easier and easier to sell the more we see this kind of crap going on in our world. And liberals are pushing LGBTQ and drag shows for children and yelling death to Jews, free Palestine, and going after their political opponents in the courtroom. It becomes much easier to sell someone who's in the middle, someone who's not a Trump supporter. It becomes much easier to sell middle America, independent America, on freedom, less taxes, less wars around the world. And against these culture wars we're seeing, it makes the Republican movement that much easier to sell to independents in this nation, because when they go extreme, Republicans can step back and say, hold on, we're not for that. Hold on. We're not for that. We're not for pushing LGBTQs and our children going to drag shows and being told to yell free Palestine. We're not for that. We're not for, on liberal campuses around the country, people yelling death to Jews, kill the Jews, death to America, death to Israel. It becomes much easier for the Republicans to sell their message of freedom, less taxes, less war. Because we're now the party against the craziness, against the nonsense. So even if people don't like Trump, they dislike Trump, all we need is them to dislike indoctrination of our youth, throwing LGBTQ and drag queens down their throat and yelling death to Jews, and all of a sudden it becomes that much easier to sell the Republican view on America right now. Because the left isn't calling out this nonsense. If anything, the left grabs onto it. And I believe this is the equal and opposite reaction. You heard that clip there. Trump is now leading Biden in a one-on-one and leading Biden even more when RFK is in the race. And the media wants you to believe everyone is against and doesn't like Donald Trump. That may be true. Democrats may not like Trump. But I could tell you something. They don't like inflation. They don't like our border being wide open. They don't like the wars going on around the world. They don't like Americans yelling death to America. They don't like Americans yelling death to Jews. They don't like America yelling death to Israel. They don't like college students yelling in the streets. America can only go up here, folks. And people are really starting to see that, because we're at a pretty low moment in our nation's history right now. And America is going to come back stronger, but I'm telling you one thing. This alienation that's going on right now is because we're finally seeing the left go too far. As I started the podcast by saying, we have seen these liberal culture wars for the last 50 years, and even going back further than that. I'm just talking about 50 years here. We've seen these movements before. Now they've gone too far. Now they're alienating themselves. Dan Bongino calls it the cannibalism effect. Because guess what? Most left-wing liberals in this country aren't for death to Jews. Most left-wing liberals in this country aren't for the indoctrination of youth. Most left-wing liberals don't want to support Hamas, a terrorist organization that kills LGBTQ people just for the fact they're LGBTQ. This message, and the message the left wing right now and these protesters are grabbing onto right now, is left-wing liberalism going too far. Left-wing liberalism gone wrong. And so when things go wrong in the Democrat Party, who do you call? They don't call Ghostbusters. Instead, they call Hillary Clinton. So here's Hillary Clinton this weekend coming out of her abyss. We all thought we were done hearing from the most hated woman in politics, but not too fast. Here's Hillary Clinton this week spitting again lies.
Was like just gaga over Putin because Putin does what he would like to do: kill his opposition, imprison his opposition, drive journalists and others into exile, rule without any check or balance. That's what Trump really wants.
I mean, she makes it so easy because, you know, if you listen to this podcast, you know I say it all the time. The MO of the Democrat Party is accuse the other side of exactly what you're doing. So when she comes out and says Trump wants death of his opposition, throw his opposition in prison, and rule without checks and balances, well, what is she really telling you? Because when you look at America today and you see what's going on right now in this nation, you see what? Joe Biden weaponizing the Department of Justice to go after Donald Trump, his political opponent. I thought that's what Trump wanted to do. Oh, wait, Joe Biden is doing that right now. At the same time, the Democrat Party and Democrats in Congress and the House of Representatives are actively trying to pass legislation that could take Donald Trump's Secret Service and make it obsolete, take it away from him. What would that do? It would open the door for assassination or someone to really hurt or harm Donald Trump. Well, I thought Trump wanted death to his opposition. Joe Biden does. The Democrats do. And then finally she says Trump wants to rule without checks and balances. We've played it on this podcast. Joe Biden talks about it all the time. He goes against the Supreme Court because he disagrees with them. That's a check and balance on the power of the presidency. And guess what? The perfect example is funding student loan forgiveness. Because the Supreme Court ruled you can't do it. What did Joe do? Went ahead and did it. So you see what's going on in this nation right now. And when Hillary comes out and says all of that, and Joe Biden is doing all of that, the message doesn't work. Especially now. I say it all the time. People on social media have a platform now where the media cannot manipulate the same way they used to. They try to silence people on social media. That's one thing. That's a problem. But the mainstream media no longer has a monopoly on information. So when Hillary Clinton comes out and says that, and people adamantly and advocately see Biden going after Trump in the courts, holding him in a courtroom during an election year, an election cycle, them trying to take away his Secret Service protection, and Biden ignoring the Supreme Court, just because Hillary Clinton comes out and says it, if anything, that puts your ears up. And so if you look at the Democrat Party right now and you see the shambles that it is, they're going to continue to try to show uniformity. They want to show you they're unified. That's why they're okay with these protests going on around the country right now. Because it gives the optical illusion that the Democrat Party is unified. I just told you, many people do not agree with many of the things of this movement and other movements of the Democrat Party, especially when you're talking about culture wars. And the proof is in the pudding. We listen to the polls. Trump is going up in the polls, not because anything Trump's doing. Remember in 2016 and 2020, they told you Donald Trump is hated? Like I said, the difference is now people hate the policy more than they hate the man. People hate the Democrat policies, their positions on these culture wars. They hate the death to Jews. They hate the pro-Palestine. They hate the pro-Hamas. They hate inflation. They hate the border. They hate the wars around the world more than they hate Donald Trump. So there is an equal and opposite reaction to all this nonsense going on in our country today. And it's middle America, independent America, that is starting to wake up and say, I may not like Donald Trump as a person. I may not like some of the things that Trump has done in his lifetime. But I don't want a president, or I don't want a movement that supports indoctrination of youth. A movement that supports kill the Jews chants. A movement that supports death to America being yelled in our streets. The average people, right, center, and left, don't agree with it. And so for the first time, we're seeing a left-wing movement that I believe has gone so far one-sided, it's gone wrong. A left-wing movement gone wrong leads to a Republican victory in 2024. So my message to Republicans out there is be the party of freedom. Talk about free speech. Talk about what's going on social media. And showcase every time we see these protests and these pro-kill the Jew protests going on, when you start seeing the videos of, yes, drag queens telling little children to yell, free Palestine, guess what? Most liberals don't want to see that. So my message to Republicans is showcase the nonsense. Because much of the left wing and majority of the middle and almost all of the right doesn't agree with the bullcrap going on in this nation right now. And so as we move forward on the Why I'm Right podcast, as I say always on these episodes, we are in the middle of an election cycle, an election year that's going to be very important to the nation's future. And when we see stuff like we've seen on this episode of indoctrination of youth, that is a political agenda right now that you need to be, wake up to. Because indoctrination of youth impacts us not now, but down the line. Because when young kids are taught to yell free Palestine, and they're taught to go support LGBTQ, and they're taught to go watch a drag queen read a dumb book, that impacts America of the future. So if you're an American that cares about this country today, tomorrow, and in the future, and you have grandkids and you have kids, again, the one way we can win the war that is the culture war in this nation right now is by simply asking, how many people actually support a drag queen show towards youth, towards young minds, 4 or 5-year-olds, telling them to yell free Palestine? I could tell you a lot less than the people that dislike Donald Trump. And we're seeing that across the world, and we're seeing that across the country. We're seeing that in liberal cities like New York City, which you saw it this past week. Construction union workers out in the streets, USA, USA, Trump, Trump, Trump. People are starting to see it for what it is, and it's our job. If you care about the future of this country, it's our job to simply ask, what are you actually supporting here? Are you aware that Hamas is a terrorist organization that murders, mutilates, and kills innocent women and children? Do you know what happened in October when Palestine and Gaza and the invasion that occurred with Hamas attacking Israel? As I said on last week's podcast, you can be against Israel's response to the attack, but you have to be educated on the fact that Israel was attacked by a terrorist organization that kills, mutilates, and murders innocent women and children. And if you are LGBTQ, They would throw you off a roof. We've seen the videos. So ask these people, what are you actually supporting? What is the educational purpose of a young 4-year-old going and sitting listening to a book read by a drag queen telling them to yell free Palestine? What's the educational value of that if not indoctrination? If it's not to indoctrinate the youth to believe and act in certain ways and sexualize youth in this nation, what's the educational value in it? And in my opinion, the parents who are driving their children to these things, to these events, I hate saying it, it's borderline child abuse. And until we call it for what it is, we're not going to see it change. But the more that it goes on in this nation, the more people will wake up. And we're seeing that in the polls every single day. So on the Why I'm Right podcast, as I always say, I have a mission here at the Why I'm Right podcast to ask the questions that many people are afraid to ask themselves. To ask why. To try to figure out what's really going on in this country. And so one way you could support that, yes, is subscribe, yes, is share, but also join the mission. And when you see these protesters supporting Hamas, a terrorist organization, when you see drag queens reading books and telling kids to yell free Palestine, comment and ask, what is the educational value of this? What do you actually support about Hamas? Are you aware of X, Y, and Z? And come educated to the conversation, because guess what? They're not educated when they come to the conversation. I've seen it in the comments on social media. People comment all the time. They don't come with facts. And they have no idea what they're protesting. I've showed it to you. And I'll say the quote again, quote, I wish I was more educated. We all wish they were more educated. But maybe that's our job. Maybe that's our mission. Maybe that's our purpose in this movement, is to educate the uneducated. Because the future of our country is on the line in this election. It is. It really is. Biden's already talking about raising taxes again in this country when inflation is at an all-time high right now. And beyond that, when they're embracing what's going on across the world, we're sending money across the world to fund other countries, and we're funding both sides of the aisle. I said it on social media again this week. Look at the foreign aid package we just signed. $95 billion foreign aid across the world. We're sending $26 billion to Israel, and we're sending $9 billion to Gaza, $9 billion to Palestine for humanitarian. Well, we're funding both sides. And you know my belief, if you've listened to my previous podcast, you know my belief, the agenda is warfare. The agenda is the war itself. Because there are people, elites, and companies like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that are the biggest lobbying groups in the country, the biggest supporters of political campaigns in this country, that do what? They monetize warfare. So when there is war across the country and we fund both sides of it, they're making the money in the middle. And in return, they're giving a kickback to politicians across this country. Look at Nikki Haley, a perfect example. Somebody that was a real Republican when she served in the Trump administration. And then she made millions of dollars when she left the Trump administration because of Boeing, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and she became a warmonger, pro-war. And so the rhinos right now on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives, they're just another Nikki Haley to me. They are. So again, the Why I'm Right podcast, we're going to continue these podcasts. We're going to continue to keep growing the Common Sense Army. Like I said, the biggest thing you could do for me is just subscribe, click it. It's pretty easy. It's free. Subscribe, share these videos with your friends, and continue the conversation. We're going to keep having the conversation here. And if you want to be on the Why I'm Right podcast, I'm happy to have you. If you are somebody who disagrees with me adamantly, send me an email. matt@whyimrightpodcast.com, and we'll have you on the podcast so we can continue the conversation. Like I said, maybe the mission is to educate the uneducated. So that when you're at a protest and you get interviewed and they say, hey, why are you here? Instead of saying, I wish I was more educated, maybe you could say, you know what, I do support terrorism. I do support killing LGBTQ because that's what these people are really doing. And they should be aware of it. So as always, this has been the Why I'm Right podcast, and I just told you why I'm right.
You've been listening to Why I'm Right. Thanks for being a part of the Common Sense Army. Our passion is to cut through the noise and confusion and to bring light to clickbait and outright lies in the media. Unafraid, unapologetic, real and raw. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on Instagram at Why I'm Right, on X at Why I'm Right Pod. And for more, hit the website at www.whyimrightpodcast.com. See you next time.